Thank you, Hai-Wen, for returning to be here with us. So by way of kind of thinking about how we were going to kind of go through this process tonight, we thought that it'd be fun to kind of give everybody in the audience a little bit of an extended sense of Hai-Wen's work and some of the relevancies in some of the past work to orientation, the piece that we've had the great fortune of being able to commission for the Street Views program. And so we will actually start, we'll be kind of moving almost backwards in time until we get to move forward. But I wonder if we can if you can first start off by kind of telling us a little bit about what it is that we're seeing here in this image of wearing winds.
Hello, everyone, first of all. I'm very happy to be here. So what you see here is a kite, and they've kind of become, I guess, the form that I'm most known for as far as in my practice. As introduced, I got my degree in fashion, and a lot of my work kind of is interested in using the language and structures of fashion in the way that we think about clothing the body, in the way we think about orienting things around the body. So a lot of the kites that I make kind of are in part designed using clothing patterns, pattern making as a formal language. And this in particular, you would pass your head through that circle in the middle, and each of the kites are wearable in some sense. And I guess I also wanted to say that that they're each also dyed, at least these early ones, in cyanotype. So they kind of become and hold records of my body as they are worn, as they are lived. I was kind of thinking and moving through Taoist thought at this time and kind of thinking about these notions of living as sculpture, living as a practice of art. So the act of walking on a sunny day, as was also mentioned, then in and of itself becomes a form of image making, in that the way the light falls on my body, the way that my body is shaped, affects how light falls on it, thus affects the image of the cyanotype itself. And you'll notice in the previous image, like on the right side here, if you notice near the top, there is a silhouette or a shadow of my hand, and that's because my hand was pressed upon my chest, or my solar plexus more exactly, as I wore this one meditating in front of a sunrise, and then that was developed and washed and fixed.
And so this also gives us a little bit of a sense of some of the really particular and I think really inventive materiality of the works. So in addition to the cyanotypes and the dyeing that's happening on the kites themselves, there are also objects like this kite spool that it's made out of copper with enamels. And some of the things that, like chains that you're seeing. Here, I think it's nice to be able to look at this, also kind of looking at an image of the kite as it kind of drapes over a seated body, and also some of the details that are happening, some of the sewing that's happening in order to be able to kind of create the structure for this object. Here, we actually get to see what this kite, the one that we saw, is looking like. There again on the left side, we're seeing that same kite, the hand that was over your solar plexus. And then, can you talk a little bit about also some of the other? So these are the blue is obviously the cyanotyping that's happening, and how those are being exposed when you're outside. During prior to the kind of flying.
Right, yeah. And I think, I guess, it's more evident here, I guess, the relationship of the image and the body. You can see kind of how the armpit area kind of obscures or occludes certain parts, such that, the parts that darken in its cyanotype are the parts that are exposed to light. But I guess, I lost my thought. I guess to say that the blue, that one is also toned. They're all cyanotype. Cyanotype is typically known to be blue. That one was kind of, I think this one was dyed in maybe black tea or wine tannins of some sort. And I think this is also kind of thinking of, I guess, just different ways of kind of approaching the material of the cyanotype, the ways of kind of sculpting light and life. The skirt on the bottom in particular records like a picnic that I went on with like friends and loved ones. And again, this idea that to go on a picnic is in of itself, a form of image making and art. And that initially I would say that a lot of these projects were kind of, when you're in the middle of like producing work in an exhibition, it can feel very like tunnel visioned and difficult. And I think sometimes artists find themselves in like these very, tight mental spaces perhaps. And I was making this work almost as a way to kind of force myself, like, well, to make the image, I have to go on a picnic with my friends, And this, I guess, this is also very evident in a lot of the other work I make, but art kind of becomes this apparatus with which we kind of allow or give ourselves permission to maybe do things that we actually want to do. Though you would think you could just do that. You can just have a picnic with your friends, yes. But then when you say like, it's for my job, it's for my art, there's a certain allowance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we'll see that actually as we move through some of these other images, that also these ways of kind of moving through the world are recorded actually in direct ways in lots of the works. Right. Here, just another couple of images of some of the ways that these kites adorn the body.
Yeah.
And then one that feels kind of very special to think about in relation to orientation, the video that we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is actually a kite for two, or a garment for two that turns into a kite, called Two Can Share Heaven.
Yeah. This one in particular, I made it while living on an island with my great friend here, Margaret. It wasn't so much like a way to force ourselves to spend time together, but it kind of became that way. But it references like traditional Chinese like emperor robes, and they kind of saw yellow as a color associated with like a specific power or kind of a god even. And I guess I was just kind of interested in this notion of, it's a very simple, like turn to just say that what if rather than one god or emperor, that it just had to be two people that shared power, And I think, maybe that's very prescient today, but there's this notion of what it means to kind of give and take, and that, it's the same relationship that I had with the kites before, where if the wind is blowing very strong, then you really don't have to do much at all to fly a kite. But if there's not much wind, then you kind of have to run a bit harder. And that kind of, again, speaking to these kind of relational aspects of living, of kind of being in tethered kind of interconnectedness with people, of knowing other people, of what it means to be like in love or with friends, these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's also nice as we kind of look at this to think about too, one of the things that we were talking about a little bit earlier today was thinking about the ways in which these objects kind of inhabit exhibition spaces. Yeah. And so you've talked about the ways in which folks will say, oh, we want to display the kite. There's actually an exhibition that your work is in right now, and it's one of the first times that one of the kites is being displayed on a mannequin form.
Right.
So really thinking about the wearability of it, but also some of those notions of kind of inside and outside that get pushed when an object like this is kind of displayed in a gallery rather than being flown in the sky.
Right.
And I think those are kind of nice pressures that we'll also kind of see as we scroll through some of these other works.
Yeah.
Including, actually, importantly, this piece Becoming Wind from 2024. And so maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about
Yeah.
what the structure of this event was.
So this was actually part of a summer-long series of sound walks that were kind of facilitated and sponsored by the Midwest Society of Acoustic Ecology. If you haven't heard of acoustic ecology, it's kind of a really, I guess, beautiful field in which these people kind of just care a lot about the sounds of spaces, the sounds of urban spaces, the sounds of natural spaces, that kind of, when cities are, say, developed in certain ways, it affects the sounds, you know, how the sonic structure and quality of that space. So I was invited to give a sound walk, which in essence is essentially a walk in which you're listening to sound. And because my work has so much relationship to the wind, I was thinking a lot about making these scores that allowed others to maybe think or attune themselves to the wind in ways that maybe I had thought of. Hearing wind. And this one, yes, I mean, it kind of says it very plainly, that understand what you're hearing is an encounter between two forces. And again, this is kind of similar to the tethering I had spoken to, similar to the sharing between two people, but that if you think about it, the wind itself is an entirely silent force, and yet it's like very powerful, right? If we think of things like hurricanes or gales. But what we hear when you hear, like, you know, screeching or howling is the sound of it reaching, say, interference, or, I mean, I don't always like to use the word interference. It feels a little like you're kind of doing something to it. I often use the word encounter, where you kind of, the wind is meeting something. So the walk, in the previous image, what I'm holding above my head is an Aeolian harp that I constructed. So it's a harp that is played by the wind. I don't need to, like, you know, intervene in any way. If the wind passes through, the strings vibrate and they resonate. I mean, very beautifully, next door, Jenny C. Jones has a show on. I think she had some Aeolian harp-esque structures on her rooftop.
At the Met exhibition.
Yes, recently, yeah. Which I was very sad to miss. But so the walk, at least, so the first score was kind of thinking about, again, these encounters, where I thought maybe in this conception of my work, where we think about relationality of what it means to kind of exist between things, between people, to kind of ask people to think of this encounter itself, this space between, say, like Dean and I, the conversation we're having as the entity itself, rather than like you and I. So kind of that, you know, asking this encounter to introduce itself. You know, what does it say? What does it hum, sing, etc.?
Mm-hmm. And then there are actually 4 movements as we move through. So here we're seeing wind. And so I think as you're kind of talking about the ways in which we see the evidence of that force kind of moving through, so thinking about things like watching leaves rustle or watching strings move or et cetera.
It's kind of asking you to, I mean, this was kind of, so it was an hour-long walk, but broken up into maybe 4 sections. And this one was kind of asking, in essence, to imagine the wind maybe doesn't exist. You know, you watch the trees maybe in the morning, you know, sway side to side, and kind of wondering, you immediately associate that psychologically with wind, but it's like, well, what if it didn't exist? If you just imagine the trees of themselves were kind of dancing or moving, you know, and it's a kind of, you know, twisting or, I don't know, you could say like queering vision or listening, that like, you know, what is happening in reality in and of itself is of course the same, what you observe, but how you observe it allows you kind of come to that experience differently. Yeah.
So then seeing wind here, then we move into the third part, moving wind, where this actually becomes a bit more relational. So what we're seeing here are people kind of responding to the prompts that are there.
Yeah, and this one, you know, I think a lot of it is again, just reimagining the wind if it were, say, something else, or just kind of becoming more conscious of it in a way where the way that we can feel each other when we press our hands to each other, say, like we can imagine that maybe that's the wind blowing upon our body. And kind of, it was a very subtle notion of us kind of being interconnected in the circle, and that it was a very, maybe slow swaying, but kind of a feeling like as you touch somebody that like, to allow this lightning, to allow yourself to be moved and blown, really. Yeah.
And then finally, the fourth part, becoming wind. And so I think as we're thinking about attuning our senses or attuning senses during the walk to watching, to listening, to touching, then there is this notion of actually kind of trying to embody the sense that the wind brings.
Yeah. And I think this was kind of just, I think it's a metaphor that many people have used over and over, this idea of our breath kind of being maybe a minute version of the wind. And again, this is kind of where I was thinking of this attunement, where you can blow against your palm, say, standing out on a windy day, and that if you blow at the right speed, that it could match the wind, that in effect your breath would disappear, that you would disappear maybe, that you would quite literally be exhaling or blowing or moving air at the same speed in which the wind is moving. And again, I think, I don't know, it's nice to think about this with like the Jenny C. Jones exhibition, because a lot of this is kind of like a conceptual sound work of like sound that is not making sound, but sound that is kind of a way of thinking or moving. Yeah.
And so as we kind of move through this, then I think one of the things that we talked about is this piece, Sitting South, which is very much about a kind of how one orients one's body in the world in a kind of somewhat sculptural way, thinking about those sensitivities to place and how one experiences a particular place if there is that kind of stillness and that receptiveness, let's say. And so Sitting South, which was created in 2021, is comprised of this chair that's built with a compass inserted into the seat. And so in each of these images, what we see are you sitting facing south.
Right, yeah. So I guess I was thinking of compasses, really, to speak about orientation more broadly. This was kind of a precursor to the piece you see outside. But I was thinking about this notion, again, of relationality, where for this piece, I was thinking of becoming the compass myself. And I was actually thinking about specifically the positionality that the medium of photography kind of holds, in which there's always the subject-viewer relationship, whereby if I am to position myself always south within an image, as a viewer, you can always use me like as an orienting point or anchor with which to orient yourself. So if you know that I'm facing, say, south in that photo, then you know that like you as a viewer now are viewing the image through, say, southeast-ish. Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit also, I think what interests me too about this work is that as much as it's a photograph, there is a kind of performative aspect of it. And so there is a kind of enfolded temporality and kind of thinking about the way in which you're sitting there and in a kind of almost meditative way. Yeah. Kind of experiencing time and place.
Yeah, there's like a sense of like audience-ship, as we see here, that chairs. And I guess it would make sense to kind of mention that within the body of all this work of orientation, of Sitting South, was that I was reading through Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, and she writes, about objects and orienting objects, and I think in particular she writes about the writing desk, and I was thinking about the chair and how chairs are such orienting objects that to sit in one is kind of direct your body in a certain way. And I think she writes about how, a desk kind of orients your body in a specific manner. So yeah, I guess I was thinking about the chair as an object that puts you as viewer of the photograph, but also subject as a viewer of what is south, within the image. And that to make the piece, I was quite literally in public, just always looking south.
So actually, your kind of southward orientation is something that actually comes up here. So what we're looking at here is a score that was developed for this piece, tuning West Wind 2.1 to 2.6.
Yeah.
And for this, what you did over the course of about a month, during all waking hours, is every hour you kind of figured out which direction you were facing and recorded that.
Yes.
And so then it actually ended up producing this image that we're looking at, where you realize that you are a south-facing person.
Yes, and I do want to say that this preceded, this information naturally arose. It wasn't because I was in the midst of my Sitting South project that I was like, oh, I'm sitting south a lot. Before that. So to standardize the measure so that, because you can stand and turn in a number of ways. So to standardize the measure, essentially my phone would buzz every hour, and I would take out a digital compass, and I would pause and measure the direction in which I was breathing. Again, kind of thinking of this analogous notion of the breath as wind. So I was kind of thinking, which direction am I offering my, say, energy towards into the world? And then this so it's called a windrose. You can kind of Google windrose. You can look at windroses that many weather stations kind of measure or keep track of data. I think in particular, there's one near O'Hare, the airport, and you can see the wind patterns, because it's very important for them to know where the prevailing winds are, which are kind of the directions of the dominant breezes in that area. And this is my windrose of the month, of February in 2022. And that I discovered I was a very south-facing person. And I also say that, I also give it a caveat, because it's not so much that I'm a south-facing person, but to think about that the life I was living in Chicago, the architectures and infrastructures with which I existed were, you could say, forcibly orienting me south. The ways you are waiting on a subway platform, or the way architecture is built so that sunlight enters it in a specific way, so that seating ends up pointing a certain way, that in sum, all of it kind of directed me south. Yeah.
And so then that actually was developed, your windrose became the structure that eventually kind of led to the creation of this piece. West Wind.
We can mute it. I think it's a more visual piece, really. I guess there's a sonic component. And I think we can just start in the middle to kind of get the gist of it. So I think what I was interested in at this point was this is kind of when I was in, I actually think this was post orientation. But I was thinking about this idea of myself existing out in the world. I had taken this month of measurements of myself, and I was kind of interested in this idea of, could I essentially recreate a week or a day of my life and just kind of point myself, in these directions. I also was thinking about, could I in effect counter my windrose to think about the ways in which the world is forcibly orienting me south? How long would it take to make myself a north-facing person? Thinking about these kind of notions. But this in particular was kind of a standalone performance where you can kind of hear these droning notes. It's me playing on flute, again, the breath. But I essentially assigned each of the cardinal directions one of the notes in the musical circle of fifths. So each of these piles of rice are associated with a single note. You'll notice I'm blindfolded, and when I'm hearing the note, I'm then trying to attune myself to that direction. And perhaps you would think, well, that's impossible because you're blindfolded. So this piece, what I was interested in, what you see just barely off camera, what you don't see just barely off camera, is that there's an industrial fan blowing a large column of air westward. And you can kind of see that by the way that the feather is behaving. I myself, again, becoming a compass with my two arms. And here I'm thinking, again, so much about relationality, of what it means to kind of exist in the world, to feel the wind, such that I can be blindfolded, but I know which direction I'm oriented and facing because I know where the wind is. That the wind itself, though it is in constant motion, becomes like a very anchoring, orienting point for me. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting to mention that the actual apparatus that you created here. So we see kind of at the very beginning of the video that this is a rod that's actually got that glove. The rod is attached to the glove.
Right. Yeah.
So it becomes, in a way, a kind of extension of your body, a kind of apparatus that the body can wear,
yeah.
much in the way that, the body is wearing the kite.
Yes.
And so making those relationships in between physicality and orientation. And we'll kind of get into that, I think, a little bit. This is maybe a moment where we get to ask everyone else to participate.
Yes. So this is kind of, in some ways, an activation that I often like to do, often to maybe kick off a talk or to kind of introduce this aspect of orientation. But if everyone would be so kind or willing to participate, I'd love to ask everyone to close their eyes and then to imagine home. And then now, slowly, think about home, think about where home is physically. And now, point at where home is. And you can open your eyes as you do this. Was that difficult for anyone? I feel like, okay, well, truthfully, I'm very lost, but I don't know. But I think I did this for the first time within a classroom setting, and it was really beautiful because there were two people that were lost in some, well, one person in particular was lost, but one person, they thought of home, and home means so many different things for people. Some people literally pointed at themselves, which I thought was quite lovely. But one person pointed at in the vague direction of Pakistan. And then the other friend, knowing that he lived in Pakistan, his home was Quebec, Canada. And he knew that because you're in Pakistan, I'm like somewhere off, this way. And that became a kind of relational anchor too, where if I know where you live, I know where I live, and I thought that was really quite lovely. But I like to use this activation to kind of get in the head sense of what I mean when I say kind of like disorientation or orientation, that there is a mental like walking out. There's often an anchor with which you find, a main road that you understand is north-south or east-west. Or say in Chicago, it's very easy because we typically just think of where the lake is, and it's like, well, the lake is east. That gives you everywhere else. I'm I myself am very lost right now in this room. I don't know which direction to point. I'd have to ask one of you where you lived, maybe. But yeah.
And what we're
Yes.
looking at actually is your childhood home.
Yes.
In this image, and you grew up actually in your early years
Yeah.
here in Missouri.
Yeah, I thought this was a really special image to kind of bring to this presentation because this is where I grew up. This is my backyard in Missouri. It's in Maryville, in the northwest corner of the state. And as you can see, the backyard is kind of an open expanse. And this is where I flew my first kites. And this is where, my dad kind of first told me about this notion of like flying a kite as wish making. This is kind of where I guess I would say I always come back to when I think of the kites as pieces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so this that notion of kind of how we center ourselves is very much at the core of orientation. And orientation, the video that we're showing, has had a number of iterations over the course of your practice.
Right.
And so the piece actually kind of, let's say, is it okay to say it began more or less in 2021 in a kind of official way, although those notions of how we kind of orient ourselves have been at play for some time in the work. But in its original iteration, it started off as a kind of way to basically make a kind of hybridization of the party game Twister and the notion of feng shui, of kind of thinking about objects in relation to each other and in relation to space, and how we kind of encounter them energetically based on those notions. And so what we're looking at is a blanket which kind of adapts those polka dots of different colors that happen on a Twister game, as well as the object that we're looking at in the lower corner becomes the spinner. Can you talk a little bit about what this object is?
Yeah, so I would say this was kind of the seed of all of the work that you saw, like the chair, the performance, the measuring breath. And again, this was kind of right off reading queer phenomenology and thinking about orientation. And I always like to borrow this phrase from my friend Konstantinos Avitsanos. They gave a talk that I really loved where they essentially said, anytime you think I'm being poetic, I'm actually being extremely literal. And I thought, when I was reading this text about orientation, I'm like, well, how do people orient themselves? They use compasses. So I was really moved by compasses as an object, partially because, the Chinese, I would say, are very proud of it. They call it like one of their 4 great inventions. And that this is sort of what, very old Chinese compasses used to look like. They were like magnetized lodestones with a ladle on it. And then the ladle would kind of spin around and be magnetized to point. Specifically, and this I found very interesting, was that they would point south. In Chinese, the word for compass, jinanzhen, that means south pointing needle. And that in and of itself it's a very simple notion because north and south are kind of bound to each other, but that we kind of think of north as a universal orienting direction, right? But it's like, no, that like you can use south also, and that in itself was a reorientation for me, that like, if like say the Western world is telling everyone to look and point north as the guiding North Star, that like, well, what's going on this way, to kind of just look back. Yeah.
And I think too, as we're kind of looking at these, it helps also to kind of think about, as we're talking about orientation as a kind of directional thing, you're bringing up Sarah Ahmed and queer phenomenology, but of course for Sarah Ahmed, what she's talking about is orientation as a kind of attraction to something else. And so even kind of thinking about the notion of the needle as a kind of binary that points north-south, kind of rereading that and rerouting that to think about also what's an attraction to another person, to another object, that kind of sensuality, the kind of queerness that can come in that reading of thinking about like, what is my orientation?
Yeah. And I guess a lot of the work is kind of saying that, like, I'm not pointing north or south. I am the needle, you know, I am the compass. I'm like right in the center. I can point any way I want.
And I think it comes out then also that what ends up happening as people are doing this is it engages folks in a kind of play of thinking about themselves in relation to other bodies. So the people who are engaged in play in the game are also kind of figuring out what's my relationship to this other body. Am I making space for you? How do we do that? Which is something that I think really comes out in the video itself.
Yeah.
Here we're seeing a still, but we can show you basically in these next images that orientation started out in quite a different way.
Yeah.
Right hand.
右手
South.
东南
And so maybe you can
Right
talk a
foot.
little bit about what the
Yeah.
shape is that we're seeing.
So what you're seeing is
Left foot.
essentially the first rendition of orientation where
Left hand.
my friend
Left.
Charlie Thornton is performing with me.
Left foot.
I was very happy to have Charlie back for the new rendition.
Right foot.
But I had asked friends, my friends Casper and Azim, they each individually recorded these instructions that you hear. Casper speaking in Mandarin and Azim kind of speaking the English directions.
Right hand.
右
And
脚
it's,
西北
I guess there became a moment in which I kind of
Right.
realized the mat itself, the twister mat, the orientation mat, was in some ways redundant because you can orient in space always. So I was interested in doing that within a space with Charlie. And what's happening is that Charlie is responding to, you know, the English instructions only,
左手
and that I'm moving only to the Chinese instructions. And I was, again, thinking of this
Left foot.
右手
idea of, I guess, the ways in which we're kind of
Left hand.
offered instruction throughout life generally, or the world, or societally, that, you know, what does it mean to, particularly for people of maybe diasporic experience or immigrants or Chinese, or I mean, like, yeah,
Right foot.
Chinese Americans, you know,
South.
西北
to kind of, to shut off, to
Right hand.
not listen to the dominant voice, to kind of, though I can understand it, to try to refuse, you know, the direction or the directive of English. And that becoming kind of, I mean, that's so much an internal mental experience that you can't really experience unless maybe you understand both languages and you're trying to orient yourself right now.
And
Yeah.
also to be clear, the directions that Charlie is listening to
Yes.
and the directions that you are listening to don't agree with each other.
Yeah.
So it may be telling Charlie left hand south, but at the same moment, it may be telling you right foot northeast.
Right.
And so what you're ending up doing is also constantly having to negotiate with each other to kind of share that space, but also to kind of move through that space by accommodating each other or,
Yeah.
you know, entering each other's physical space also.
Yeah, yeah. It was kind of this idea of, you know, what being bound up, you know, with one another, what it means to kind of share space, literally, that we're not trying to drift apart to give each other space. It's like we want to exist together, but that we're being told different things, that we're being told to live life in different ways, but that we kind of then have to kind of to listen and make space, you know, in physical ways, in other ways. It's a really, I don't know if it's visible, but it's a very physically taxing piece, you know, to support yourself on all four limbs for really like minutes on end, an unending kind of twister hell.
I think too, I wonder if we can kind of talk a little bit, like return to this idea of thinking about your experience as someone who grew up speaking two languages,
Yeah.
and kind of what that's kind of bringing, because you have talked about this kind of notion of needing to kind of tune out the
Yeah.
English in order to be able to kind of focus on the Mandarin instructions and to be able to kind of execute those. But that actually ended up being something that, as we kind of realized this newer version of orientation, because the Street View series does not have sound, you created a kind of new version of this piece that is in itself silent.
Right.
And so what we're seeing here in this still, and here you'll get to see a bit of it as it appears in the video, are Charlie, who has returned as your collaborator for this new iteration of it. And so the footnotes that we're seeing are the instructions that
Yeah.
you're following.
Yeah, they kind of, I guess, I'm curious, how many people that experience and view this piece really try to read them. I think because you can experience the piece without them, but that they offer some sort of, I guess, a score or a hint to kind of tell you what's happening, that if you follow the logic that we are moving, in very consistent ways as far as like what's being said and told. And I'm curious about the experience of people who say can read both languages and understand that, oh, that's not a mirrored caption. It's not saying what the other language is saying, And then, this would take such immense effort, but to kind of reach that understanding that like who is moving to what, that they're moving differently. And I guess it kind of privileges, so I don't want to say privilege, but like that directs itself at a very, very particular experience, I guess, which you could say is specific to, say, like my upbringing or people of Chinese diaspora. But I think I guess I wanted to speak to your notion earlier that it's kind of interesting because I wouldn't say I'm fluent in Chinese, and I think part of the piece, in the way that like, the earlier pieces were like, forcing myself to have fun and go on picnics. That maybe this piece was like, well, I'm gonna like listen, I really need to know like my Chinese directions now, Like I had like to rehearse, I had to really get into it. And I think about, as far as like rejecting, English is like, it is kind of, that it becomes comfortable also, and maybe this is like resonates with people of, who kind of share two languages. Like my parents would speak to me in Chinese, but I have to say my parents' English is very good. I just responded back in English, I never had to develop or really practice that. And again, it's kind of living within those two spaces where, you're literally speaking two different languages, but there's this space with which you can communicate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's nice also to kind of think about the freedom that happens within those spaces when one actually can kind of choose that directionality or the kind of way that one orients themselves through things that are both familiar or unfamiliar, through physical things, through kind of conceptual ideas about what space is or how we kind of organize ourselves in particular spaces.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from anybody? Yeah, in the back. We'll bring a mic to you.
They ask questions a lot too, you're right. I have a question. Oh, sorry. The piece with Charlie reminds me of a psychological test, and I was wondering if you were familiar with the Stroop test.
Stroop test, could you remind me what it is?
Yeah, so you start off by saying the name or the color that the word is written in. So like red would be written in red,
Yes,
yellow written in yellow. And then at one point you switch and you have to say the word but not the color, and another
Right.
time you have to say the color but not the word, and they're mismatched. And I was wondering for you, since Mandarin doesn't sound like Mandarin is your primary language, if it was really difficult to tune out the English and focus in on the Mandarin.
Yeah.
Especially since I noticed your head movements sometimes don't necessarily fit the flow of your body. Like there might be some cognitive dissonance for you. Just curious what that was like to tune out.
I mean, that's such a great question, and I love that you kind of tuned in on, the motions of my head, and that. I mean, before we did the final take with Charlie, we kept doing new takes because, I think I mess up more because I understand both. That it was kind of like a lot of mental processing, and the directives kind of move, at a steady and fast pace. So I think I'm glad that you could pick that up. That it's so many layers of, I have to first make the English become noise. I have to understand what the Chinese instruction is. Then I have to figure out where I am. Then I have to point at the direction I'm being told, and do all of that within maybe 5 seconds. And then the next instruction is repeated again. So it is kind of like a certain mental load. I'm familiar with that test, but I mean, it wasn't particularly in mind for this piece, but I can see kind of the connections there as far as kind of this idea of kind of, I guess in psychology, a lot of it is like kind of, they talk a lot about like mental heuristics and kind of like how do you overcome the shortcuts that your brain makes. That of course we want to read the word, but it's so much harder to say the color that the word is, And again, that is a type of reorientation to kind of pause and challenge, the ways in which things are written or stated to us and just say, this can be experienced a different way. Yeah, thank you. Oh.
So my question is, when you're doing the project where it's basically Twister, except you have directions for where to put your hands and feet, how do you know what the directions were? Like, did you have a compass or something?
That's a good question. With the mat is always placed down in a specific way so that I guess I didn't mention this, as far as the connection to feng shui is kind of that each of the colors is associated energetically with a direction. So like black is like south because it's associated with the element of water. And so then we would just reach towards the black circles if we were told to go south. Speaking of mental heuristics, that's also why we removed the mat, is because then we were just like, just find that color. We didn't have to do any orienting in our bodies. So in space, when we're performing the piece, we literally just do what you did when you tried to find home. We located for ourselves things within the room that we were performing. Particularly hard, I have to say, in this room where we're recording, where it's a seamless white wall, because one corner is like white nothingness. But we located things within the room. I think to make it easier, we taped like an S for south on one off-screen wall, floor. So we know where that is, and then that gives us everything else. Does that make sense?
During the process of kind of collecting all the data to create your windrows and facing south and whatnot, since then, have you found yourself either like consciously or reflexively, like if you find yourself dysregulated or feeling anxious, like pointing yourself south? Has that become an emotional orientation for you?
That's such an interesting question. If anything, east. Really? Because I'm always looking at sunrises. The sun becomes like a very orienting, I guess, anchor for me. I don't know which direction I'm facing now. I don't know if, I'm curious now, if I did this enough, if I did it a year long, more than a month, if I would begin to kind of energetically feel like, well, I'm back south and kind of like, swing back towards that. And it was kind of, I mean, I guess I didn't commit to the bit. Like there was in my head the thought to pursue it for a year or longer, such that I could kind of really feel it in an embodied way. And I am curious if that might have happened, to kind of then begin to associate certain directions with certain feelings or emotions. But no, I didn't reach, I didn't reach that, yeah.
It's also quite nice, this idea that an orientation can be an emotional orientation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's like that. Just kind of playing into it again, as we're saying, going back to the idea of feng shui that you bring into, there are comfortable or there are natural orientations, and when you stray from those natural orientations, things become imbalanced.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of those things are founded on like, your door should be on a specific cardinal direction, or like because the wind moves through, it's like literally blowing the bad spirits like into your home. Don't do that, It's like that I do wonder, if, and I mean, a lot of the work is pointing at these kind of notions. Again, let's point away from Western notions of, understanding space. Let's kind of look at maybe some Eastern philosophical precedents where I wonder if all of those homes that they lived in were like made with these principles in mind, that they may have really truly felt that like, oh, our homes are energetically aligned, so you feel good, Maybe they don't think I feel good facing south, but they like this certain, direction or orientation of their space.
Right.
Yeah.
Hi, I loved your talk. I have a question about materiality, and I just noticed that you're really a maker, and I can tell that you love material, and then you're also working with immaterial, like wind and direction. And you talked about kind of realizing that you didn't need the mat, and kind of in service of the idea, like the body is the material. So I guess I was just wondering how you think about that balance of process and making, and then how that works with these other forces that are intangible.
Fantastic question. I think, like, my first thought is it kind of has to do, I want to say it has a little bit to do with ego, but I don't know if that's like the most accurate answer. I think a lot of my work tends to be, like, I also really enjoy like chance operations. There's something about, I think, like self-effacement or like releasing the hand that I find really attractive. And I don't know if I could tell you like exactly why, if there's like some, deep-seated, like, I don't want to be responsible type, thought down there. But that I'm often looking, I mean, we could call it reorientation again, that like, well, the sun has been here, who knows how long, millions of years, surely it knows better than me, that it can paint and take a photograph better than I can, or that the wind, I'm more interested in how the wind draws something, or things like, like the scores for orientation, they're randomly generated, in that I kind of feed them through a random output, algorithm of sorts, and that I'm interested in chance in that way, that, that any person trying to be random can never be random, that you have to kind of let go, that you kind of have to let things move as they do. And I guess I think that ego is not quite right, because there is a certain ego in imposing the score also, that I build the algorithm, so there is a hand there. But maybe that's also a relationality that I'm interested in, where I have somebody in grad school described it as like a light touch. I'm interested in light touch, in kind of like a guiding of like, how do I give a touch such that the wind becomes like more visible as a player, maybe. But yeah.
I mean, I think it's also maybe interesting to think that the hand can not only make, but the hand can also point. And thinking about that idea of a kind of art-making practice as pointing towards something, of kind of trying to get us to reorient the way that we're actually looking at or kind of experiencing the way that we're moving through the world.
Yeah. I guess, yeah, to kind of add on to that, to kind of think about, a lot of the practice is about attention and tending to things. A lot of it is kind of thinking about, as you said, kind of shaping the way we think about like time passing or living life, to kind of point at those things. Just the way that seeds kind of fall on you, that those kind of affect how you live, the way that the wind's blowing that day kind of affects how you live, all these things, yeah.
Excellent. Well, Hai-Wen, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for passing this time with us and for facing this talk.
Thank you, yeah.